Is this on? Is this on? Okay. Good morning. Let's try again. Good morning. Much better. Thank you. I'm Greg Turner. I'm president of the Alumni Association this year, and I want to thank you for attending Technology Day and welcome you all this morning. First off, I want to thank the Tech Day Committee for its work, and I want to welcome President Susan Hockfield to our event today. I want to thank the faculty, especially those who will be participating in the panel later. I want to thank you again for coming, and we want to thank those of you who are viewing this program through the web. As we start, I'd like to ask everybody to make sure that their cell phones are either off or on silent mode, please, so that we can eliminate any interruptions. I want to let everyone know, obviously, the theme for this morning's program is advanced manufacturing and the transformative power that it promises. We are going to have some remarks by President Hockfield, and then there will be presentations by the faculty involved in advanced manufacturing, as well as two alumni entrepreneurs who are currently engaged in some exciting manufacturing endeavors. If you're interested in reading the biographical information of our speakers today, they are all in the program flyers that you got as you walked in, or they're also viewable from the Tech Day page of the Alumni Association website. So at this time, I'd like to invite President Susan Hockfield to come up to the stage to lead us off. And please welcome President Hockfield.
Good morning, everyone. Greg, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for serving as president of the Alumni Association. It's been fabulous working with you, as it invariably is. Every year, a new president. They're just great. We've got a fantastic program for you this morning that is focusing on manufacturing, a topic that could not be more central to MIT's work or to America's future prosperity. You know, when we started working with the faculty and talking about manufacturing and whether we could lend a hand, it just, in the context of the 150th last year, it all became one piece. MIT was founded to accelerate the industrial progress of the nation. And, you know, we've been working on that same theme ever since. Every era has a little variant, but it's wonderful to be actively back in the center of helping the nation to reimagine its future in manufacturing. So over the last about 2 years, the faculty have renewed their engagement in mostly focusing on the opportunities that advanced manufacturing presents, and you're going to hear about this afternoon. So as someone who knows only the littlest about it, I'm very enthusiastic about it, but we'll let the professionals talk to you about it. This is, as you know, my last Tech Day as president of MIT. So I thought I would indulge myself and do a little bit of a retrospective and just hit some of the highlights of what we've done together over the almost 8 years that I've been part of the MIT community. And as I start, I just want to underscore how important the engagement and the dedication of the alumni have been to our progress. All of the activities that we've done have been tested against alumni populations, and you all have just been the most incredible enthusiasts and supporters of our work together. So when I start thinking about the last several years, many people call out the, what shall we say, the turbulent and terrifying financial climate that we've weathered over these last several years. And, you know, it's true. The global economy tanked. It feels like it's only on just, you know, stumbling toward recovery, maybe. Today's news coming out of Europe is just as dismal as it seems to be every week or every other week. But the economic downturn hit us at a time when we had stabilized the Institute's financial structure, and we were as well positioned as we could possibly be for some really terrible thing to happen. And then we built on the goodwill and active engagement of our whole community and designed and implemented a strategy to deal with that fiscal challenge that would also strengthen the community. And it was a shared trial, and I would say a shared triumph. So in my own mind, when I think back over these last 8 years, I don't think about the global economic meltdown. That happened. We weathered it. That's the way you have to be positioned, to take the crazy things that come out of the environment in a way that allows you to continue moving in the direction that you've laid out. So I'm going to set that aside and instead focus on 3 themes where I have to tell you, I'm so proud of this community for what we've been able to do. The first is the way we've expanded our academic and research directions. The second is how we pioneered the digital education revolution. And the third is an area that just has to be always part of our activities, which is we've invested in improving the campus. On that first theme of expanding our academic research directions, our incredibly successful MIT Energy Initiative has, I think, well, it's amazed me and I think it's astounded everyone. At this point, about 25% of the faculty have participated in energy research, and you're going to hear from some of them today. It has engaged our students in incredible ways and our alumni also. We have a graduate student-led energy club that has, I don't know how many thousands of members. I always tell you what the number is, and someone in the audience shouts out, no, it's not, 4,000, it's 4,500, whatever it is, it's thousands. It just reflects their interest. And MIT has really become a major voice, perhaps the major voice among universities for new energy technology, energy policy, and also energy education. When we thought about the opportunities around energy and the importance of our producing graduates who can engage as energy pioneers around the nation and around the world, it became clear that the very important deep disciplinary dive that people take as a major at MIT continues to be the great strength of the MIT education, but in addition to that, we had to equip students to approach energy from across the curriculum. The energy minor was launched 3 years ago just to do that. And the minor pairs with any major at MIT and allows and requires students to learn about energy from many different perspectives, including all of our 5 schools. Another very important potential activity that I saw when I arrived at MIT, but was happening all over the place, is the convergence of the life sciences with engineering. Many of you have heard me tell my little kind of story about this, that the story of the 20th century was written in the convergence of the physical sciences with engineering that produced electronics and computers and the information industry. Now that biology has become a more quantitative science, engineers are picking up the tools of biology and turning them to use in solving all kinds of problems. At MIT, of course, we started the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research. We have a group in collaboration with MGH trying to develop a vaccine against AIDS. We have people working on autism. Across biomedicine, this convergence is having a very big impact, but even beyond. And you may hear about some of the great future biomanufacturing opportunities today in our manufacturing session. The third area is manufacturing. Again, I hope you'll hear some of the context at MIT, but we launched our own study called Production in the Innovation Economy that I often refer to as Made in America 2.0. Many of you will remember Made in America 1.0 that we initiated during a previous downturn in manufacturing enthusiasm in the United States. And we hope that PI, Production in the Innovation Economy, will have the same kind of impact on rejuvenating manufacturing. I was in Washington a lot over the last 8 years, but I was at the White House talking about our enthusiasm for figuring out what the best path forward might be for manufacturing in America. And no good deed goes unpunished. As a consequence of those conversations, I was invited to chair the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, a study collaboration between industry, government, and the academy. And I co-chaired that I'm co-chairing that with Andrew Liveris, the CEO of Dow. And you will hear much more about manufacturing this morning. Another thing that we've done is we've expanded our international partnerships. MIT has been engaged internationally, helping to build education, engaging in research, basically from the beginning of the 20th century. We have expanded those engagements with a lot of marvelously productive and fascinating activities in Singapore. We've helped develop the Masdar Institute for Science and Technology, a graduate educational entity in Abu Dhabi. And just this fall, we launched the Skolkovo Institute for Science and Technology, or SK Tech, a collaboration with our colleagues, not just in Russia, but all around the world, to develop a state-of-the-art educational and research program for research and education. At the same time that we've been working around the world, we've been figuring out how to amplify our regional advantages. And we have engaged even more than we have in the past in the area around Kendall Square. We did a fabulous collaboration with 4 universities, 2 industry partners in the government, and launched the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computing Center. This is going to be a computing center that we put in Holyoke, a region of the Commonwealth that is desperate for the tools to get back involved in the great economic enterprise of the Commonwealth in the United States. We leveraged off the High Performance Computing Center just last week or the week before to announce 3 new big data initiatives out of MIT that involves also the Commonwealth. And as I said, we're doing our part to keep Kendall Square vibrant and actually have it develop as more rapidly than it has been. When you walk around campus, there are 2 big cranes as you come across the Mass Ave Bridge. And whenever I see them, I think, are we building something at MIT? And then I remember that's Novartis expanding its research footprint on MIT property that we've leased, and also Pfizer building a new research lab. I think we have 3 or 4 of the top international pharmaceutical companies building major research activities here in Cambridge. I want to segue now into the future of education, and more particularly the future of online education. Under Chuck Vest's visionary leadership, MIT launched OpenCourseWare 10 years ago. It was in the context of a lot of universities scrambling to try to figure out how they might make money from online education, and Chuck gave a set of faculty the charge to figure out how MIT should do it, and the faculty came back and said, we've analyzed it every possible way, and you can't make money at it. We should just give our educational materials away for free. And on that audacious premise, OpenCourseWare was launched. We now have material for over 2,000 courses online, available to anyone in the world with an internet connection for free. OpenCourseWare in these first 10 years has had 125 million users. The impact on people's lives, frankly, just brings tears to my eyes. We get emails and messages from people around the world in places, frankly, I've never heard of before, describing how OpenCourseWare has opened the world of learning in a way that they have never had that door open to them before. Now, one of the consequences of having 125 million users around the world is that everywhere I go, someone pulls me aside or asks a question in an audience like this, I'd really like a credential. Will you do that? So in response to that great desire to be able to show employers or the people in your educational institution that you've completed an important piece of work, and also to reflect the opportunities that we see online, past December, we launched MITx, and in April, we announced a collaboration with Harvard for a technological platform called edX. MITx and edX will take online learning to the next level. Following the OCW model, the content will be free, but if you want a credential, you'll have to pay a little bit for it. Our first course, 6002X, I don't know why we didn't start with an introductory course. And when I learned it was going to be circuits and electronics with prerequisites of differential equations, linear algebra, and electricity and magnetism, I said, sounds great. Maybe 500 people will sign up for the course. 120,000 people registered. Go figure. And of course, not all of them have completed the course, but almost 10,000 completed the course. And I would say, I think it was 7,000 by the last count. I don't have all the final numbers, but people say, oh, only 7,000 finished. And I said, only 7,000. more than our 4,300, 4,300 undergraduates right now for one course. In any case, this will be transformative both in terms of how we teach on campus and also how we offer educational opportunities to people who can't possibly come to campus. And probably most importantly, it is going to teach us a lot about how people learn. So that's very, very exciting. I will just say one thing. I've heard concern mostly from our students about how MITx and edX might possibly erode the value of an MIT degree. You know, OpenCourseWare has done just the opposite. I credit OpenCourseWare for having made MIT even more attractive to even more people. Applications to MIT have increased by almost 75% over these last 8 years. I obviously think that's great news. It's really bad news for the students applying because this year we admitted fewer than 9% of the applicants. And even more astonishingly, of the students we invited, about 75%, 76% elected to come to MIT. So we have a very strong and growing strength in our brand. The last big topic is investing in the campus, and this is something that you just can't take your eye off the ball. Our gorgeous buildings, canonical buildings, are almost 100 years old, and you know, they need some help. And so we launched a project, actually we being mostly Terry Stone as my EVP, who's with us today, as a very proud MIT alumna. We launched a project that's called MIT 2030, because you know you can't take on a problem unless you understand it. What MIT 2030 did is gave us an understanding of our campus. What's the state of the buildings? What are our academic ambitions? How can our academic ambitions be served by our buildings? What are the opportunities for building on campus? Can we put some of our off-campus properties to better use to actually create a better neighborhood and generate some good revenue for MIT? All of these things were embraced in a project. It is an enormous project, but happily, it gives us a framework for making decisions about how we're going to tackle the older buildings on our campus. So we've made some progress on the older buildings. I hope you will get a chance to at least peek into what you will remember as Ashdown House or Graduate House. It is reborn as Faribault's Massey Hall, and the centerpiece of this is a magnificent dining room called the Howard. And as I said, you've got to just take a look to see what that quite dilapidated building looks like in its new refreshed state. We recovered the 80 Little building to modern glory. You'll take a look at that when you move down to the area of Sloan. And other projects in planning stages now is a major renovation of Building 2 for math and chemistry. When we get that started, that'll be the first move on tackling the deferred maintenance of the main group. We also are working on a project to renovate what is now the former Sloan building, E52, and a magnificent project that we envision to turn the very dilapidated Walker Memorial into a glorious center for the performing arts, theater, and music at MIT. More work to be done, but I have an able successor who will carry that out. And the last building project I would, actually, let me talk a little bit about the new projects. It's not just recovering old projects. We opened the Koch Institute. I mentioned that a minute ago. A new building for Sloan, magnificent building that is really bringing the school together in an unprecedented way. Very exciting, great benefit for both education and research. The new Media Lab complex is simply glorious. We built an infill inside the physics, material science piece of the main group, which also permitted major renovations of the main group. And anyway, the list goes on. It has been an exciting 7 years in terms of assessing and then really tackling some of the demands of the campus. We have made lots of progress, as I said, on these physical things, but the one I love the most, it was the first project I think we completed, and it was relighting the dome. We've also repaired the dome. We're working again on the infrastructure of the dome. The dome was McLaurin's commitment to MIT that we would have an icon that would share our beacon of inspiration with the world. We relit the dome at reunions in June of 2007. 2007. Many of you may have been there. It was a kind of a drizzly night. But when the dome lights went on, it was as if the sun was shining, and that is perhaps my most favorite project. So we've made lots of progress, and I credit the progress we've been able to make, and actually it's an astonishing set of accomplishments, and I don't take credit for it myself. Where I really give credit is to the broad engagement of our community, our faculty, students, staff, and alumni. People at MIT have a way of pulling together around important issues that, frankly, I've never seen before. So I'm enormously grateful to this community for making it possible to tackle some of the most serious challenges of MIT, but also the most serious challenges of the world. So I want to thank you for offering me the incredible privilege of your guidance, your support, your friendly criticism, mostly was friendly, and your personal friendship. It is wonderful for the Institute and wonderful for the world to have the devoted attentions of our alumni. So it is a bit bittersweet to be leaving, but it's made infinitely sweeter by the confidence that I have in my successor as the 17th president of MIT, my provost, Raphael Reif, a professor of electrical engineering, computer science. I came from the outside, a bizarre biologist, and Raphael has been at MIT for over 30 years, a great engineer. And I think one of the things that's most exciting for me is that the agenda that I've just described was an agenda that was formed, imagined, implemented entirely by Raphael and me, working very, very closely together. So I have confidence that some of the great initiatives I've just described will continue. And I also have confidence that you will welcome Raphael just as warmly as you welcome me, or maybe even more so since he's got the MIT creds coming in. I hope to see many of you. Obviously, we'll be at the lunch, many of you, but tonight, final Big Bash, Toast to Tech, in a big tent on North Court, the area between the Koch Institute, the Stata Center, the Koch Biology Building, and 1656. It should be a great evening, and I look forward to further celebrating tonight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Susan. Greatly appreciate your remarks and your presidency. At this time, I'd like to invite to the stage the Alumni Association's President's Committee, as well as our EVP and CEO, Judy Cole. These are Ann Street, class of 69, Ken Wong, class of 71, Chiquita White, class of 1985. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing a special Alumni Association tribute to Susan Hockfield to honor her tenure as MIT's 16th president. The Institute has thrived during Susan's nearly 8 years at the helm. She strengthened the MIT community, not just for students, staff, and faculty, but for alumni as well, and for mascots. Susan has spoken at 75 club events worldwide, opened her home to reunion attendees, and led the charge to celebrate 150 years of MIT that inspired more school spirit and alumni pride than I have ever witnessed before. Her vision to expand energy research and encourage more interdisciplinary work between the life sciences and engineering has given MIT renewed purpose to solve difficult problems in service to the world. She's described her job in part as encouraging gardens for the beautiful flowers of innovation that dot this campus. Susan, you have done more than encourage a beautiful landscape. You are a consummate gardener, and we are forever grateful for your wisdom, energy, and green thumb. We now would like to read the resolution that we have of appreciation for Susan. Whereas the honoree Susan Hockfield has served as MIT president for over 7 years, and whereas she has called for an information army to rise and attest to MIT's growing value and its mission in the world, and
whereas she has guided the Institute through troubled financial waters and safely to shore with new management methods that will support MIT in the future, and whereas she has spurred the campus renewal, including the construction of the Sloan School expansion and the new Ashdown House, the rehabilitation of Massey Hall, and the MIT 2030 planning process, and
whereas she has served as an infinite gardener, concentrating the ideas that continually blossom on campus into productive gardens, such as the MIT Energy Initiative and the David H. Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research, and whereas she has connected the global alumni body through 75 visits to clubs and groups during her presidential tenure, and
whereas she has challenged students to smash previous senior gift records and inspired alumni and MIT friends to support the Institute financially to exceptional heights, and whereas she was recognized by the association for her outstanding service with an honorary membership in 2010, and
whereas she has held high our founder, William Barton Rogers' commitment to meritocracy, rigor, and service, and her tenure at MIT's helm has strengthened the Institute's education, research, and global outreach in momentous ways. It is therefore with profound gratitude that we hereby congratulate and commend Susan Hockfield for her service to the Alumni Association and for her past, present, and future service to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This resolution, voted unanimously by the Board of Directors of the MIT Alumni Association on the 6th day of June, 2012. Susan, thank you for the garden you have created for the MIT community that will continue to blossom. It is my honor to present you with 2 gifts to recognize your partnership with the Alumni Association. The first is a photo book that captures your years of service at MIT and the impact you've made in the lives of so many. And we couldn't let you go without your own brass rat of sorts. As a neuroscientist and the first life scientist to lead MIT, we thought it fitting to fashion this one-of-a-kind pin representing the basal ganglia of the brain. And it's been fashioned out of an official brass rat ring. The pin symbolizes the growth and convergence of the life sciences and engineering that you have inspired at MIT. For those of you in the audience, you can see a picture of the pin and learn more about its unique design by going to the program insert that you received this morning. And are we pinning it on? Is it?
We'll do that. With a seat.
Okay. Again, we appreciate everything you've done, Susan, and we hope that you'll take these gifts as a memento of the kind feelings that we in the Alumni Association have for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Now it's time for us to get on with the program for technology today. And so at this time, I would like to introduce Brian Anthony, SM 98 and PhD 2006. Brian will be the moderator for the program today. He's the director of the Master of Engineering and Manufacturing program here and co-director of the Medical Electronic Device Realization Center. Brian?
Just give us a moment as we do the laptop switch. So my job today is to get you thinking a little bit about manufacturing in the national and in the MIT context, and to introduce the speakers. I'll just start with some questions, which are, I think, the second slide. By a show of hands, to get your juices flowing, and I'll report on some data that I'm going to ask here as well. Of the people in the audience, if I were to ask you, is manufacturing important to our economy, to our national security, and to our future, who in the audience would say yes? Raise your hand. Okay, so pretty significant amount. Who amongst you encouraged your children to go into manufacturing? Okay, maybe 2%. So what does that say about your perception about manufacturing? And today, I want to talk about your perception of manufacturing, and I want you to consider your perception and also the ecosystem around manufacturing, the people, the technology, and the innovations. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions. So we asked the first one. If you asked 1,000 people, this was a survey done by Deloitte, if you asked 1,000 people nationwide if they thought manufacturing were important, as we did here, 80%, over 80% said yes. Those same 1,000 people, if they thought their child should pursue a career in manufacturing, less than 25% said yes. So, anybody in manufacturing or has had a career in manufacturing in the audience? Okay, I see a few hands. So, who took a degree program specifically preparing you for manufacturing? Okay, very few. Okay, so manufacturing is important. We say it's important. We're not going to encourage our children to go into it, and we're maybe a little bit deficient on what we're doing to prepare people for manufacturing. What's the unemployment rate for engineers in manufacturing nationwide? Depending which survey you believe, between 2 and 4%. Not any place even close to 10%. Where do most patents originate? Manufacturing. And depending which survey you read, it's between 50 and 85% of the patents in the US are originating in some way from manufacturing. Okay. The top 15 countries in manufacturing, who are they? I was asked for the top 3. China, US, I heard, did anybody say US? Germany, Japan. Who, by show of hands, who thinks it's China? Okay. Who thinks it's the United States? Okay. Up until 2010, China was second. We're now sort of tied with China. It's the United States, China, and Japan. So the United States has not, contrary to popular perception over the last decade, our contribution to value add in manufacturing globally has not really diminished. It's been going strong. China's increasing, and we'll hear more about this data, I think, from Ali Dweck later. So we don't like being second. So as President Hockfield indicated, in June, President Obama created the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, which President Hockfield has been co-chairing, to really try to bring together industry, government, and academia to address the issues that are important to the economy and to the nation in manufacturing, to figure out the things that we invent here are manufactured here. Okay. So an observation, not mine alone, companies are going to locate where they find the best people, the best technology, and the best incentives. So the questions that I want you to think about today: what are these essential components and the growth requirements for this foundation of our economy of manufacturing? How do we go about, and is it important to attract the best and brightest, the people, into manufacturing? Are you going to encourage your children or your grandchildren to go into manufacturing? How do we maintain the sustained supply of innovations and technology in manufacturing? And constantly think about your perception of manufacturing. Okay, so we can't talk about manufacturing in today's environment without prefacing it with the word advanced. So we do advanced manufacturing now. I would argue that manufacturing, advanced or otherwise, has always been and is fairly advanced. And let me just show a couple videos before I introduce our first speaker about things that you probably think about in manufacturing. This is a pick-and-place machine. It's a robot. It's a blister pack that it's moving it from one place to the next. These videos that we're going to see are high-speed videos of manufacturing processes, variously acquired between 2,000 and 40,000 frames per second, so you can see what's actually going on. You can see the advanced technology of these things. So people would think about automation equipment, pick and place, blister packs to hold fluids or drugs. Yeah. Packaging is another one that people think of, a lot of automation equipment. How do you go about continually getting your toothpaste, not into the tube, but into the box that you're going to use, you're going to buy it from off the shelf? But before that, you actually have to make the box. So here's an assembly process where we're putting a handle onto a box, some automation equipment, some very complex design to bring these various pieces of cardboard together with adhesives on them to make a package. You probably didn't have cookies for breakfast, but you're making cookies. You have a very complex conveying system. Variously, it's going to take one cookie straight across, one cookie towards you. Everybody's wearing some clothing, so you need to do some fabric manufacturing, weaving. If you look a little more closely, a sewing machine, a very complex manufacturing process, the stitching underneath the weaving process. Painting, understanding the particle distribution, the flow of material. Soldering. This is a solder ball being deposited on an electronic. You see that one's not showing up that well. And my favorite one, this is an end mill. So an end mill being basically a device to do subtractive manufacturing, to take a piece of metal and to carve pieces away from it. We see the end mill turning around, and it's not touching anything just yet. As soon as it's going to hit the metal, see the metal shard flying away. You see the smoke emanating from around the metal. This is not advanced manufacturing, is what people would define it now, but it's manufacturing, and it's very advanced. So there's a lot of technology in terms of just understanding and controlling the various aspects of the processes you're viewing. So with that, again, today, I'd like you to think about what are these essential components. Think about the people that are required, the innovations, the technology, and your perception of manufacturing. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Professor Ali Dweck is an associate professor of aeronautics and astronautics in the engineering systems division as well. He's the executive director of PI, Production in the Innovation Economy. Ali is going to summarize a yet-to-be-released report. I think it will be released in, December 2012 in Washington, D.C., on the state of manufacturing in the U.S. Ali?
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to see all of you here this beautiful morning in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to talk about manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, which is really a critical topic for the nation and for the world. And my goal in the next 30 minutes or so is to share with you some of the research that we've done as part of the Production in the Innovation Economy, thank you very much, project, which was initiated by President Hockfield in November of 2010. As was said, it's inspired by the Made in America study that was carried out here at MIT in 1986 to 89. And we are taking a very broad look at the current state and the future of manufacturing and its importance to the nation. I would like to acknowledge colleagues. I would like to acknowledge Professor Susan Hockfield of Political Science and Professor Phil Sharp, Institute Professor and Professor of Biology, who are the two co-chairs of the study. I would also like to acknowledge the funding that we've been able to receive with help also from President Hockfield, funding from three foundations, the Kaufman Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Sloan Foundation, as well as a gift from Lockheed Martin Corporation and some of the alumni as well. So we are very grateful for that. So let me start as a starting point with a discussion of the Made in America project, which is really the starting point. Made in America had a big impact. It was a study that was initiated in the mid-1980s. It was led by Michael Dertuzos, Richard Lester, and Bob Solow. And it was really prompted by a sea change at the time, which was due to the rise of Japan as a major industrial nation. And Japan really taught us a very important lesson. And the lesson that Japan taught us, and this was one of the big focal points of the Made in America project, was that quality, high quality, and low-cost manufacturing were not, that there was not a real trade-off, that you could, in fact, produce high quality at low cost, that you didn't have to choose one or the other. And the way to do that was to introduce lean manufacturing, to really understand where the bottlenecks in manufacturing, where the inefficiencies were, and also the idea of Kaizen, the idea that you want to, every year, every production run, every lot that you manufacture, you want to get better and better in multiple dimensions. Made in America was decomposed as a study into 8 sectors. These 8 sectors that you see represented here: semiconductors and computers, office equipment, automobiles, steel, consumer electronics, chemicals and pharmaceuticals, textiles, machine tools, and commercial aircraft. And each of these sectors had a working group that was dedicated to it. At that time in the 1980s, the amount of data that was available to really understand what is happening in these sectors, who are the key players, what are the drivers of productivity, the visibility had to be created. So a lot of the effort went into gathering data to paint a picture of what's happening in each of these 8 sectors. One of the advantages today is that we don't have a paucity of data, but we almost have an overabundance of data, and I'll show you some of this data in a minute. The central message of Made in America was that American industry really needed to step up its game, increase productivity and performance, and also to reorganize the way that we thought about human resources and technology within the firms. The study appeared both as a hard copy as well as a soft copy and has sold over 300,000 copies, had a big impact on industry, and was translated into 8 languages. So let's look at some of the data and some of the evolution of manufacturing since Made in America was published here in 1989. The first graph I'd like to show you is, and Brian showed you a snapshot from 2010 on this measure that's called manufacturing value add, and this is in units of trillions of dollars per year. The blue curve represents the evolution of manufacturing value added in the United States or produced by the United States. The way you measure manufacturing value add is that you quantify the value of the inputs into the manufacturing process, including raw materials, parts, and you quantify the value or the price, essentially, of the outputs, and you take the difference. You can do this for a single manufacturing step, such as the steps you saw in the videos that Brian showed, or you can do it for a whole sequence of steps. And if we look at this curve, we see that the perception, some of the public perception, that the U.S. is not manufacturing anymore, not as vigorously as it did. It really isn't true when you look at this particular measure of manufacturing value added. If we look back at the orange curve, which is the evolution of Japan's manufacturing value added, if you put yourself back into the mid and late 1980s, the worry that the United States was going to lose its #1 position to Japan was very warranted, as you can see here. Japan, in fact, was on a very steep trajectory to become the #1 industrial nation in the world. But then something happened. In 1994, there was a big real estate bubble and banking crisis in Japan. And ever since, Japan has really been relatively flat and, in fact, losing some of its industry in recent years. The big story in the last decade is the rise of China. So the red curve here shows you, especially over the last decade, the rise of manufacturing value added in China. Initially, of course, a lot of this was manufacturing of consumer products and lower value added products. But in recent years, manufacturing in China also includes very high-tech products, high-speed trains, airplanes, areas where the United States has been the world leader. At this point, as was shown prior, both China and the United States produce about 20% each of manufacturing global output. So China and the US together produce about 40% of all the manufactured goods in the world in terms of measured value added. So the big story is not so much a decline in US manufacturing, but it is the rise of China to be an equal to the United States in terms of manufacturing value added. The decline that is often talked about is actually the decline in employment. And so this graph here shows you the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States. Here we have the blue curve, and it's been very pronounced in the last decade, in the last 10 years. These categories here are captured by the North American Industrial Classification System. So all the various industries in the US are being classified. And the ones in manufacturing, these are the NAICS codes 31, 32, and 33. You can see that relatively stable over this period from 1989 to 2000, employment has been about 18 million jobs in manufacturing. And this is really counting people that are directly involved on a manufacturing line, whose jobs are directly involved with manufacturing processes. Since 2000, we have lost about a third of those jobs. So we have 6 million jobs less in direct manufacturing compared to a decade ago. But on the other hand, and I'm showing you here another category of jobs, these are service jobs, including in retail, in transportation, and logistics, that are enablers of manufacturing. There has been an increase in jobs from about 22 million to about 26 million. But you can see that there's a deficit here, a structural deficit of 2 million jobs. The reason this decline has occurred is for two reasons. One is the increase in productivity. So exactly the main message of Made in America, that we need to step up industrial productivity, that has in fact occurred. And so we can produce this large manufacturing value added that I showed you with many fewer people because of the advances in productivity, new machinery, new processes. But it is also due to, of course, to offshoring. And just to show you a little bit why we know this to be true, I'd like to show you a short video here on that one of the students in our study produced. This is the change in manufacturing establishments. These are essentially manufacturing plants in the US between 1989 and recently. And so the blue colors show you an addition of manufacturing, new manufacturing plants. The yellow and then red show you a loss of manufacturing establishments. These are manufacturing establishments with 500 or more employees. And so we see that up until roughly the year 2000, there's a mix of blue and mainly yellow. And mainly in the last decade, then you can see that, that there has been a loss of manufacturing, a closing of manufacturing plants with 500 or more employees. So if we look at the net cumulative change over that period, we can see that, different regions of the US have been affected in different ways. So California and the West Coast, of course, the industrial upper Midwest, also here in the Northeast, and the Southeast has actually had also a net loss of manufacturing establishment. Some of these are due to consolidations, but a lot of these are due to the offshoring and closing of manufacturing plants in the US. And this is one of the things that we're quite concerned about. One more piece of graphic, and then we'll get into the study into some more detail. This is all happening on a backdrop of continuing innovation. We continue to be the world's leading innovator in a number of measures. And what I'm showing you here is the number of patents issued, filed by country per year. This is data from the World Intellectual Property Office. Again, the blue curve here, the United States. You can see that at this point, the United States is producing about 500,000 patents per year. And we continue, we are leading in this category. But again, here, the red curve, you can see that China is catching up very fast. So we continue to be very innovative. We continue to manufacture a lot of value added, but it takes fewer people to do so. So this leads us essentially to the key questions that are at the heart of the PI study. What might happen if we became a nation of pure innovators? In other words, we focus on R&D, design, and then services and logistics at the back end. What would that look like? Is that even a sustainable model? We don't think it is. We've been looking at this question for over a year now, and the consensus that is emerging is that manufacturing, the middle piece, is essential. It is essential because of a few reasons. One is that there's a multiplier effect. The manufacturing activities, in fact, give rise to service activities that are supporting and enabling the manufacturing, so it's part of a larger ecosystem. And there's also a feedback loop where if you stop manufacturing at scale, eventually your ability to innovate at the front end is also greatly reduced. So how can we harness more value as a nation embedded in the global economy from our innovations? And there's two sub-questions I'd like to share some data and initial insights with you. One of the questions is, what are the new technologies that are coming along? And this is an area where MIT really is a leader in terms of new technologies that have the potential not just to enhance, but really transform manufacturing as we know it today. And then the second question is related to the new companies that we're creating, the startup companies. Is the finance model and the capital, the skills that these companies need to be successful, is it available to the new firms, particularly those firms that focus on physical products? And so let me share with you the architecture of the PI study that is tackling these questions. So our starting point is this diagram here. How does innovation happening at the universities in existing firms? We know that a lot of innovation is happening in regional clusters and, of course, entrepreneurship. How is that impacting the economy, the job growth, the income distribution, and also the labor relations? And as a starting point, it became clear very quickly that this picture was much too simple, that innovation cannot directly impact economic outcomes, but it impacts economic outcomes, in a sense, indirectly through the real economy. So we have the innovation process on the left, and here we have the real economy with production, manufacturing of physical goods, and then services. And you can see that in terms of services, we really need to distinguish two types of services. Services that are directly enabled by or in support of manufacturing. So these are the manufacturing-related services. That is that multiplier effect I was talking about. And then non-manufacturing services that, of course, do exist. If we look at the various connections here, we really have a complex system where innovations are enhancing and making production more effective. We have the scale-up of, and also scale-down challenge, which I'll address, and the impact of both manufacturing and service jobs on the economy. And very important, we believe that the government has a very important role to play in that system. And this is the government both at the federal level, but also at the state and regional level. Susan, in her remarks, mentioned the new initiative here in Massachusetts in the Commonwealth. And this is, I think, a great example of how industry, academia, and the government can work together to make the system as a whole more healthy. And there are two key feedback loops that we think are important. One is the continued investment in early research, the R&D investment to feed the innovations, to keep the innovation pipeline healthy. And then the second is the setting the right conditions for capital, labor, and skills so that the functioning of the real economy can be healthy. So the way we structured the PI study is quite different from Made in America. Made in America was organized by those 8 sectors of the economy that I mentioned to you. The PI study is really organized around the key loops and the key relationships, the key causal relationships in this manufacturing system. And I will just briefly discuss the various modules of the study. We also have a backbone where we're conducting over 200 interviews of various firms. And I'll share with you a little bit some initial insights from that. So each of the modules of the PI study is looking at one of these key arrows, one of these key causal links in the manufacturing system. The first module is looking at innovation in manufacturing. So what are the prospects of new manufacturing technologies such as nanomanufacturing, robotics, and so forth? The second module is looking at scale-up. How do these innovations that we're talking about, those early upstream innovations, how do they transition from the lab to early startups, to later startups? What does it take to facilitate and support that growth? Scale down. One of our commissioners, we have on the commission 20 faculty members from engineering, from Sloan. It's really a fantastic group of faculty who are bringing all their perspectives. One of our colleagues, Sanjay Sarma, who's a professor of mechanical engineering, has coined this term, breaking the tyranny of bulk. And the premise here is that a lot of the manufacturing ecosystem, including the logistics, including the supplier structure, is geared for bulk manufacturing. If you're manufacturing in bulk, you can do it very effectively. But if you want to manufacture small batches, if you want to be flexible, if you want to respond to different customer needs, it's much more difficult to do. So how do we break the tyranny of bulk and create a way to scale down smaller and yet effective manufacturing units? Module 4, skills and training of the U.S. workforce. This is turning out to be one of the major themes in the study. We need people that have multiple levels of skills. We need PhDs, we need advanced engineers, we need the kind of people that MIT produces, but we also need a workforce that is working on the shop floor, that is really understanding these advanced machines, how to program them, how to use them to their most effect. And we think there's a big role here to play for the community college system. We don't have in the United States a tradition of entrepreneurship. We don't have a tradition of the trades as in some of the European countries with the apprenticeship system. That's the word I was looking for, the apprenticeship system. And so we think the community college system has a very important role to play in educating highly skilled people that really can provide the workforce in the manufacturing plants of the future. This is a big theme that's emerging. Module 5, labor market puzzles. We do see, if we look at the income distribution in the U.S., a bifurcation. We see that the middle jobs, the middle class jobs in manufacturing, because in part of the plant closures that I showed you, are not disappearing completely, but there's fewer of these jobs available, and we see a polarization of the workforce and a spillover effect in the communities that are affected by these changes. How can we understand and quantify those effects? Public policy and firm strategies. What are policy recommendations in terms of supporting and creating an active and healthy manufacturing ecosystem? We're doing a comparative analysis of the US, Germany, Japan, but also some of the more recent manufacturers like China. Cross-border partnerships. There's the rise of China, as you saw, is one of the key themes now, and we really want to take a differentiated view of this problem. There are examples of firms that very effectively partner and view China not just as a place to manufacture, but also as a market. So what are win-win, potential win-win arrangements that the U.S. can make and firms can make in cross-border partnerships? And then Module 8, as I mentioned to you, is essentially the backbone, is doing the very exciting but also hard work of visiting companies, interviewing people, and really understanding from the bottom up what the current situation is. Currently, we've conducted over 144 interviews. We have 18 more scheduled this summer, and we think we will meet and exceed the target of 200 interviews. I want to share with you just in a few minutes some initial findings from, I can't cover all the modules in my remarks, but I will discuss modules 1 and 2 and share with you a little bit some insights from the backbone interviews that we've done to date. Module 1, innovation in manufacturing. So we started this last year by saying, well, let's start in our own backyard. What's happening at MIT? So we've done an internal scan at MIT. We've looked at over 20 different labs. We've done in-depth interviews and looked at the papers, the patents that are coming out. And this is just a very, a small sample of what we're seeing. And there's a lot of good news. There's exciting research happening. MIT is one of the leaders in this area. I'll just pick out a couple of examples, and you're going to hear later this morning from Professor Marcus Bühler in this area of nanomaterials and Professor Jones Prather on biomanufacturing. Those are two of the big themes at MIT, being able to manufacture and create and synthesize material at the nanoscale and at multiple scales, the use of biology in manufacturing, but also areas like batteries, so efficient storage of energy, smart robotics, solar and photovoltaics, as well as innovating, I would say, in the ecosystem of manufacturing, new concepts for flexible supply chains, understanding how we recycle materials and feed materials back into the supply chain. So those are some of the key themes we're observing at MIT. We're also conducting a survey at this moment, actually, of 85. There are 85 programs at U.S. universities in industrial engineering and manufacturing, which is encouraging. So we want to understand what are they working on, how healthy are these programs, and what do they see as the key trends in manufacturing. And so here's just a list of some of the initial responses. Areas like additive manufacturing, 3D printers, potentially even at home, that people will be able to manufacture things at home. Freeform manufacturing, that means manufacturing that does not require custom tooling. Tooling is very expensive, so if you can eliminate tooling and have more flexible processes, that could be a game changer. Again, the scalable nano-manufacturing, solar energy conversion, smart automation, and then biomanufacturing, including the growing of human organs from stem cells. The other thing we're doing, we're asking people to rank different technology areas in terms of how promising they think that these are. The different colors here indicate different categories of technologies. So in gray, we have technologies related to automation and precision manufacturing. Blue is related to new types of materials. Red is the IT. Advanced manufacturing requires a lot of sensing and control so that you can understand what's happening in real time. And then in green, we have the technologies that are making manufacturing use less energy and be more efficient. And what's interesting is the rankings that we're seeing. We're also seeing that some of the technologies, there's not agreement, there's not universal agreement. So for example, the area of rapid prototyping and additive manufacturing, we have a number of people who are saying that indeed will transform manufacturing. It is the wave of the future to build up materials layer by layer. Other people are saying, well, maybe not. Maybe we'll be able to do prototypes with these technologies, but to really get the the life cycle properties out of the materials that we need, rapid prototyping may, in fact, not get there eventually. So we're trying to identify areas of technology where there's more or less agreement, and then other areas where there's controversy. And I think that will be an interesting contribution as well. What I'd like to do now, just in 1 or 2 minutes, in this framework that I will present to you here, you will see it again this morning in the other presentations, is really this question. Brian Anthony alluded to it. What do we really mean by advanced manufacturing? And I think a picture is emerging as to what's happening in advanced manufacturing. So the classical view of manufacturing is essentially a linear process where you take raw materials from nature here on the left, you feed them into a fabrication, a number of fabrication steps. Fabrication means making parts, essentially. And then you have an assembly, either manual or robotically assisted assembly, and you have finished products. Now, in advanced manufacturing, we still have fabrication and assembly. Those basic steps don't go away, but we've augmented manufacturing in a number of ways. And those technologies that I discussed with you, we think that the augmentation of manufacturing falls into 4 areas. The first one is this idea of material design. The idea that, yes, we're still taking raw materials from nature, but we now have the ability to synthesize materials that have properties that we could never create before. And you'll hear much more about this later. So this is a step in manufacturing that is as crucial or even more crucial than classical fabrication and assembly. It's a third major step that precedes fabrication. The second big trend that we see is the blurring of the boundary between fabrication and assembly. The idea that there's a continuous a blurring of the boundary, and one of the examples here at MIT is the center, the Novartis-funded Center on Continuous Manufacturing of Pharmaceuticals. This is a trend to get more efficiency, get more flexibility. Also, the work on smart automation definitely fits well into this area here. The third major trend is bundling of services and software in with physical products. So a lot of companies that you talk to these days, they view the physical product here, this finished physical product, not as really the final product, but the final product is an integrated solution to a problem that has bundled with the physical product services and software in a very integrated way. And then the fourth trend is the recycling, the recovery of materials in a very, very aggressive way, and to feed these recovered materials either back into the fabrication step or back into the material synthesis. And what we have here is a much enhanced view of manufacturing, and a definition of this would be that advanced manufacturing today is the creation of these integrated solutions that require physical products. You can't do it without the finished physical products, but it's coupled with value-added services and software while exploiting custom designed and potentially recycled materials, and doing this in a really ultra-efficient way. That's, in a sense, our vision for advanced manufacturing, and my colleagues this morning are going to talk to you about different pieces and how their research contributes to pushing the boundaries on this enhanced view of what is advanced manufacturing. Okay. Let me share with you briefly some data from Module 2. Module 2 is the module that's looking at the scale-up, the question of how do innovations help us start new companies, and how do these companies grow over time. Again, here the strategy was to start in our own backyard, start with data at MIT, and then look more broadly. And the news here is really quite encouraging. We started with a database from TLO, that's the Technology Licensing Office at MIT. So the cohort of companies that we analyzed is just a subset of all the companies that MIT helped start in the last few decades. It's the subset of companies that chose to license technologies invented at MIT through TLO. In total, we've looked at 192, so almost 200 companies that were started between 1997 and 2008. And we're finding that 78% of these startup companies founded between 4 and 15 years ago are still active or have been acquired. So in that sense, you can say they're successful. Of the subset, 2/3 of them are headquartered in Massachusetts. Other locations are California, 3% outside the US. And you can see here the variety of companies. I think this is one of the great strengths of MIT, is that we really are producing innovations in very many different domains. Biopharma and medical devices are a major thrust, but also software, electronics, semiconductors, and robotics. One of the concerns we have, or one of the questions that we have, is that of these active firms, and I'll show you on the next chart, we do have some big success stories to tell, but a number of these firms have revenues that are below $5 million. Now, you can argue they're still in the growth phase, and there's a question of how long does it take to mature and grow them more quickly, but the question is, what do these companies really require to scale up more quickly? And this is one of the big things we're after in the PI studies, understanding the factors that really make the ecosystem promote the growth of these companies more quickly. The other thing which we thought was encouraging is that 3/4 of the companies, 142 out of these 192 firms, 74% actually manufacture or are working on physical products. And this was, I think, an important finding that we could find. The firms, these startup firms, these 192 firms, essentially fall into these 4 trajectories. So we have in blue the high growth companies, the companies that have achieved a revenue of $100 million or more per year within, having been founded between 4 and 15 years ago. So what are the factors that enabled that organic growth? The limited growth or slower growth companies, and that's 57% of them, that they're healthy, they're active, but their revenues are less than $100 million per year. What factors could enable stronger or more sustained growth? Is it capital? Is it skills? Is it market access? 17% of the companies were merged or acquired by others. What happened after the acquisition? What happened to the innovations? Where's the workforce? And then the 22% of companies that did not succeed, what factors contributed to the closing of these companies? We believe that this is not a problem. We believe that if you are doing high-risk things, if you're really trying to innovate and push the envelope, that a certain number of failures is actually a healthy sign. We don't see this as a problem. So we're continuing, we're expanding now the study to Massachusetts and other states in the United States, but we're finding a lot of encouragement in this data. Let me conclude by sharing with you just some, I would call these proof of concept models for innovative manufacturing in the US. This is based on the 140 interviews we've done so far. So while there's been a loss of manufacturing employment in the US, as I've shared with you, we do see encouraging signs, and we see models for how to successfully be in innovative manufacturing in this country. And there's 6 models that we've laid out. We're still discussing whether these are complementary models or there's hybrids of these, but I'd like to share just these 6 proof of concept models with you. The first of these 6 is established large manufacturers. So these are manufacturing companies that were started in the United States. They've had a centuries or decades-long history in the US, and they continue to thrive. However, they're also, so in terms of continuing to manufacture in the US, they're becoming ultra-productive. In other words, they're introducing automation, they are becoming very efficient, and they also have foreign plants. So many of the firms, so these are 2 examples of firms we think fall into this category. Timken, a major manufacturer of bearings and other hardware products in Ohio, and DuPont, of course. They have a global portfolio of manufacturing. And it's not a question of should there be manufacturing in the US or not, but it is how do these firms balance their global portfolio? The second category is the small entrepreneurial firms that I just talked to you about on the prior charts. So these are new companies that were started in the last 4, 10, 15 years, and we see examples of these that are manufacturing, that are starting new plants, that have vigorous activity. And so the question there is on scale-up. What will it take long-term, medium and long-term, for these firms to really grow, to be sustainable, and to eventually to become, you know, the large established manufacturers? So how do we promote those particular firms? The third category, and you know, here in Massachusetts, a lot of those companies are located not necessarily directly in Boston or the greater Boston area, but out on the 495 belt in western Massachusetts. We find companies that are mid-sized manufacturers. Manufacturers who've been around in some case also for decades, but they're very good at doing specific things. They've identified specific niches. They emphasize flexibility, responsiveness, customization, and those value-added services that I was talking to you about. Syncor, for example, also actually an MIT spin-out company, manufacturer of DC power supplies, and a very interesting company here in Baltimore called Marlin Steel Wire Products, a company that used to make bagel baskets for bagels, making bagels, and is now expanded and much more high-tech and providing wire steel products for a variety of industries. A very, very interesting company. So let me continue. The fourth model here is, I would say, manufacturers who benefit from particular conditions, either market or regulatory-based conditions, that make manufacturing in the US very attractive. And so we have on the defense side, we have manufacturers like Northrop Grumman, for example, or here locally, of course, Biogen and IDEC, who really benefit from either a very strong domestic market or a regulatory environment that makes manufacturing in the US very attractive. The fifth model is, and we've especially since 2010, I think we've seen more examples of manufacturing firms that are essentially foreign firms. They're headquartered abroad, who are establishing new manufacturing plants in the US. Two examples here, Michelin, Saint-Gobain. These both happen to be French companies, but they are, for a variety of reasons, are finding the US to be a very attractive place. A lot of these new manufacturing plants tend to be in the southeast of the United States, and we do see a lot of recent activity on this. And then the last category is bulk manufacturing of commodities, and that's maybe a little surprising. It's essentially the things that you may think we shouldn't manufacture in the US because these are bulk products, and you might think maybe in a lower labor country this makes more sense. But the key metric here is what we call value density. So this is dollars per kilogram, so on a mass basis, or dollars per cubic meter on a volumetric basis. These products are such that the transportation cost is such an important factor in the overall life cycle cost of these products that manufacturing close to the market actually makes more sense. And so P&G, 3M, are examples of very innovative US manufacturers that are realizing that it doesn't make sense to go far away because the market is close and the value density of these products is such that manufacturing more locally or regionally makes sense. So manufacturing has a lot of different aspects to it. We're seeing that innovation is a major driver, and we're seeing a lot of opportunities for the US in the global context to really move the ball forward. So I'd like to conclude with a quick summary of some of our initial findings. It is true that US manufacturing has declined in terms of employment. It has not declined in terms of value added. And it's critical because of the complex nature of the system that we've discussed. So the multiplier effect on the rest of the economy is critical, and the feedback back to the innovation system. There's renewed interest in the United States at the national scale, but also at the regional scale. The various initiatives by PCAST, the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, co-chaired by President Hockfield. There's a new program office at NIST that is coordinating manufacturing activities across different federal agencies. All of these are very encouraging signs. We've launched the PI study as a major initiative at MIT. We're expecting a formal release of the study in December in Washington, D.C., and a major book. In fact, we're discussing 2 books, a shorter book that's more of a summary, and then a more detailed edited volume that will have a lot of the details on the modules that I briefly discussed with you by May of 2013. So we're really looking forward to that. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we're quite encouraged by what we're finding so far. So I'm at the end of my remarks. If you are interested to learn more about Pi, I encourage you to go to this website, web.mit.edu/pi, and I hope that this was informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie.
Okay,
I'll take
great.
that. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I think you should keep that on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good job. Okay. So, Ollie, thank you again. Next up, I'd like to introduce Professor Crystal Jones-Prather. She's the Theodore T. Miller Career Development Associate Professor of Chemical Engineering at MIT. Her talk today, as soon as we get the laptop switched, are on bio-based products, homegrown manufacturing. Okay. Here we go.
So it's a pleasure to be here this morning. It's not uncommon for younger faculty to feel a little bit of trepidation when teaching MIT students for the first time. Our students do have a reputation for wanting to challenge conventional wisdom. So you can imagine what it feels like to address an audience of hundreds of MIT students who emerged emboldened in their ability to challenge conventional wisdom and authority at every step. So hopefully you'll find my remarks to be informative. I want to start by using my title slide to actually set the stage for what I'm going to talk about when I say bio-based products. And this actually is in part driven by 2 different things. One is that traditionally in the U.S., when we think about biotechnology, we think about... Okay, I can do that. MIT taught me how to talk loudly as well. No problem. And feedback actually works, so this is good. Okay, so let me start from the beginning again. So traditionally in the U.S., when we think about biotechnology, the first thing that comes to mind is what in the EU and Asia is referred to as red biotechnology. And this actually came out in Ollie's remarks as well when he talked about bio-based products as being growing organs and tissues as an example. What I'm going to talk about today in terms of homegrown manufacturing and bio-based products is on the chemical side of things. Okay, so this is setting the stage a little bit differently for that. And hopefully as I go through my remarks, you'll be able to see why this distinction is very important. Let's see if this is working. Okay, so let me start by setting the picture. This is traditionally what we think about and what now is referred to as white biotechnology or industrial biotechnology. So if you think about this, I'm a chemical engineer, you think about this as a process flow diagram. We start by looking at our inputs, which in this case is crude oil, and you get a series of outputs. So on the left-hand side of this is the fuels. And I do work on biofuels. I only mentioned that briefly today, but really what I want to talk about is the part that I think we often forget about when we think about how crude oil is used both in this country and around the world. And that is for this other part which gives us petrochemicals. And these are the chemical building blocks that go into a number of different products that are of interest to us. Things like materials, the plastic casings that go on our laptops, the fibers, you saw a machine in Brian's remarks of fibers being sewn together, the fibers that go into the coverings of the chairs that you're sitting on right now. So you'll hear later today about other alternatives for energy. And we can think about if we're looking at, for example, fueling cars. This is liquid transportation fuels primarily. You can talk about whether or not there are alternatives for energy to be able to move people and places around. But this part of the puzzle is actually talking about carbon not being used for the energy in the carbon-carbon bonds, but being used for its mass. So when we think about replacing this picture and what we're going to do as oil supplies become more and more limited, it's a slightly different proposition than what we may have been used to thinking about before. So instead, what we like to think about as a corollary to the traditional refinery concept is a biorefinery, where now your feedstocks have changed and you're looking at primarily biomass now, or carbohydrates. And we're still interested in the fuels, and of course there's a lot of work going on at MIT and around the world in terms of being able to bring, especially rapidly, alternatives to petroleum-derived fuels to market. But I think we really have to think about this concept of a biorefinery overall, where we also look at the other half of existing petroleum refineries and ask, how do we actually get those value-added chemicals that we currently get from petroleum, how do we get those at reasonable price and cost and scale from biomass as well? And so I'm actually borrowing a quote from one of my faculty colleagues who's also a class of 2003 alum from Corsin, who describes this as changing the paradigm from a CH2-based one, that is one based on hydrocarbons, to a CH2O one, or one that's based on carbohydrates. So what I like to do in this talk is to just really first give you a little bit of framework for where I see the feedstocks in terms of where they exist now, and what we envision in terms of looking at the biomass part of it. And then I'm really going to focus in on the research that we do at a relatively high level that's about bringing this biorefinery concept to life with a primary focus on these value-added biochemicals. So let's start by looking at where crude oil is actually distributed in the U.S., because I think, especially in the context of the opening remarks you've heard, it's really useful to think about how can bio-based manufacturing really change our economy based on where the feedstock is coming from. And these issues of transportation become really important when you think about this. So this is the most recent data I could find from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and the sizes of these dots represent, roughly speaking, the size of these proven oil reserves. And you can see just by looking very visually that the largest segments here are California, Texas, Alaska, and then you have pretty significant reserves offshore as well. Right, and you don't see many dots over here. We don't have a whole lot going on in oil here. And in fact, Texas, Alaska, that should be Alaska, not Alabama, North Dakota, and California account for 55% of crude oil production in the U.S. So it's not very widely distributed as we think about how manufacturing from these sources could contribute to the U.S. economy. Well, now that's a feedstock, and I showed you this picture of that feedstock coming in and going to other products. So the question is, well, where are those products actually processed? And in fact, only 3 states, Texas, Louisiana, and California, account for more than half of the refining capacity in the U.S. Okay, so we're starting already with a manufacturing platform where the resources we know are limited. And if we look at how that's affecting the economy in the U.S., it's also fairly distributed in a fairly narrow range as well. So now you can compare that with how biomass is distributed in the U.S. And I put this asterisk here to indicate the fact that this is representing non-food crops. So we can talk about that in the panel, but this is an attempt to get away from the food versus fuel or food versus fuel and chemicals debate. And this was a report from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab in the U.S., that looked at sustainable sources of biomass, so things like agricultural residues, the non-food part once the agricultural products are produced, municipal waste, and dedicated energy crops. And you can see the map looks very different. This is, again, color-coded according to mass, or according to the productive capacity by county in the U.S. And so you see, again, California has lots of opportunities for many things, but you see California showing up here again, but now you get the Midwest being much more highly represented than it was, for example, in oil distribution. And you start to get much more of the United States being involved as a place where feedstock could come. So if we look at this, the take-home message here is that biomass, first of all, is readily available. This was part of a larger report that came up with an estimate of about 1 billion tons per year of renewable, sustainable biomass that had the potential to be produced in the U.S. on U.S. soil. But it's also more broadly distributed. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later, but it's a way to think about then what I mean when I talk about how, as we transition from more petroleum-based feedstock to a biomass-based feedstock, it really is looking at not just a different kind of manufacturing, but a different distribution of that manufacturing, and the effects, therefore, on the economy in the U.S. Becomes manifest in a different way. So Ali presented this slide before, and so let me talk about, again, what I've already introduced, as well as what I'm going to talk about that's more specific to my own research in the context of advanced manufacturing. So the first is that as we're still taking raw materials from nature, but these are new feedstocks. So again, we're going from the hydrocarbon feedstocks to the carbohydrate feedstocks. And what new feedstocks gives you then is the potential to actually think about this materials design process and to think about, are there new materials that we can make that have two benefits? One is that we can actually produce them more efficiently from biomass. So we look at the fact that we're starting with a different substrate, a different feedstock, and the question is, what is it that we can make that has the properties that we want, but to produce it as efficiently as possible, given what this feedstock is? And then the second part of this is that we can start now from the materials design part of it and say, well, let's not just be stuck with what we already have. Let's take the MIT perspective, which is we have what we have, but surely we could do something better. And think about it from the perspective of what do we actually need? Where are there missing links in terms of performance, for example, with materials, that allow us to take that perspective and to put that back into the design of the materials that we would get? So the goal here is to be able to have both something that's efficiently produced from our new feedstock, as well as something that's going to address a need as we've defined it, and allow us to have this design cycle continue. The third part of this is that there are new opportunities for thinking about how to recycle finished products if you have a new feedstock. Now, it is not true that just because a material would come from biomass, meaning it originally came, if you go back, from CO2 from the environment and energy from photosynthesis, that doesn't necessarily mean that those products are inherently recyclable. But it does mean, on average, the potential for now incorporating into that material's design the ability for that material to be reincorporated using the biosphere to do this, and the vast network of microbial ecology, that's more than likely than not. So we can think about that, again, as part of the design process, and think about how do we end up with finished products that actually maximize our potential to actually close this loop. And then finally, the fabrication part from my group is about how do we actually take those new feedstocks now, these carbohydrates, convert them into the compounds that we're interested in. Now, there are traditionally two different ways to think about this. You can look at thermochemical conversion, so this is slightly more akin to what traditional petroleum refinery would look like, except that your feedstock is different, but a lot of the unit operations, for those of you who are chemical engineers, would be the same. We actually focus on biological conversion in this case, in which we're now using biology, which gave us the feedstock to begin with, to do the conversion into the finished products that we're interested in. So I'd like to take the last about 8 minutes or so and talk about how we do that in our lab. Surely I have to talk about my own research at some point here. So we've been, I'll give you a little of my background. I actually graduated from MIT in '94. I went to grad school, and then I went to industry for a while and worked in Merck, and I came back. And when I was in Merck, I was involved in an area called biocatalysis, where we look at using biological enzymes, or biological substrates, enzymes, to be able to convert specific substrates of interest to products of interest. And so again, I came to MIT, you got to do something bigger and better. And I thought, well, can we think about how do we actually expand upon the capacity of biology to do synthesis? And historically, if you think about how biological synthesis has worked or fermentation has worked, one of the best classical examples is penicillin. In my field, biochemical engineering, really emerged around a desire to address the manufacturing challenges with penicillin. But penicillin is a compound that bugs already produce, and the pathways for that have been well elucidated. So our goal was to say, let's not focus on what nature has given us as pathways, but let's think about, again, in this context of manufacturing, what are the products we want to be able to make? And even if we don't know how to make them, well, that's why we came to MIT, to figure out things we didn't know how to do, then we'll be able to get towards the final product still using the tools of biology. So we call our approach retrobiosynthetic pathway design. It's analogous to how chemists think about synthesis. That is, chemists typically will look at what's a product, and the objective is that, the expectation rather, is that even if you've never made it before, you can figure out some way in order to do that. And we envision that at the end of the day, what we have now are microbial chemical factories. So you can just now think about that huge refinery shrunken down to about 1 micron. And within that 1 micron of space, then you have a number of chemical reactions that are happening that we've engineered the organisms to then spit out the compound that we're interested in. So we do work on being able to make products of interest that can be used as fuels, but we also are especially interested in chemicals, and in particular in specialty chemicals, because of this value-added proposition, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So the approach that we take, again, is to take now some of the principles of biocatalysis I've already talked about, and then metabolic engineering, which is really a systems-level approach that tells us how to put complex systems together, how do we then analyze those systems and then debottleneck them to come up with different approaches or different systems that allow us to make the molecules that we want. And again, we're using a product-focused approach to this, and I'll go through a specific example to actually explain what that means. So the question then becomes, well, what do you make? So this gets back to what I said before, and that if you have a different feedstock, it's useful to think about what is it that that feedstock provides that allows you to make a unique set of materials that can give you properties that you won't necessarily have from what's currently available. So the DOE attempted to answer this question about 8 years ago now in a report called Top Value-Added Chemicals from Biomass. They came up with a list of what is called the top 10 list. My favorite thing about the top 10 list is that it actually has 14 compounds on it, which is how you know engineers put it together. It's an order of magnitude estimate that it is a top 10 list. So there are lots of things on here. My favorite to talk about these days is glycerol, and it actually emphasizes how you have to be aware of the market and how the market changes. Today, glycerol is anything but a value-added product. It's actually a waste product from biodiesel manufacturing. But in 2004, there was an effort to be able to use it as a platform chemical and to get the production costs down. So we went through a number of these different compounds. We came up with 2 we were interested in working on, mostly because of the challenge associated with how do we make a product that we don't know how to make. And I'm just going to give you a couple of slides to show you how we did that for this compound called 3-hydroxybutyrolactone. So here's now an example of this molecule. It's shown up here in the upper right. This point here, which is that for those of you who may be chemists in the room, that this is a product that exists in equilibrium with this hydrolyzed form. And in fact, if we can make this form, we're happy. We know we can get the closed ring form of the lactone. So this is actually a compound that's currently used quite a bit actually in pharmaceutical manufacturing. The wholesale cost of it is about $450 per kilogram. I'm always struck by this. We pay $20 to $50 per gram for it. Apparently we pay for packaging. I was told that by one company. And you can see that at this cost, it's actually fine to use it for pharmaceuticals. But if you want to go after some of these other markets, such as solvents that the DOE projected, then that's just too much. So you can't pay that much for solvents. We were intrigued by this because there are no known biological routes to either of those two things. Okay, so I'm a first-year assistant professor. I have a first-year graduate student. I said, your goal is to make this. I don't have any idea how to make it. Nature doesn't have any idea how to make it, but you get to graduate once you've made it. It turns out that is all the motivation that MIT students need. So the important thing for us to realize is that we didn't know how to make this, but nature knew how to make molecules that looked a lot like this. Okay, so don't worry, you're not actually supposed to see any of the structures here. You're just supposed to look at that and say, okay, that's a lot of different structures. And what's in common about each of these structures is 2 things. One is that each of them have been incorporated into a class of naturally occurring biological molecules called PHA biopolymers, or polyhydroxyalkanoate biopolymers. The other thing that's true about all of them is they have the common feature of a hydroxyl group at the 3 position and a carboxylic acid at the 1 position here. Okay, so we didn't know how to make the compound we were interested in, but we figured out nature makes something kind of close. We were able to figure out how to make the free monomer form of this 3-hydroxybutyrate, as well as a close structural analog, 3-hydroxyvalerate. So we weren't making the polymers, we were making the monomers. And then we recognized the big differences between these 2 molecules and the one we want to make is actually the presence of a hydroxyl group here. Okay, so based on that knowledge, what we were able to do was to design a new pathway where we were able to pull out the biological elements from that central pathway. We discovered a few new enzymes that allowed us now to incorporate some new functionality. At the end, we ended up with a process where we can actually make now the compound that we're interested in that had no biological precedent. Now, again, in thinking about how do you have the most efficient manufacturing processes, this pathway starts with feeding in glucose, which is one of those CH2O molecules that would come from biomass. as well as a compound called glycolate. But we wanted to take this further and figure out how do we get the cells to actually make this so we only have a single feedstock, which would drive down cost of goods. Okay, so that's a sort of a big picture. Let me give you some challenges and opportunities. And you'll notice that I haven't broken these out and said, here are the challenges and here are the opportunities. I think that's another MIT thing. Any challenge is an opportunity to be able to figure out how do you overcome this limitation. The first of these is logistics, and this actually came up before, in that if you start to think about transportation costs, then there's the ability as well as the challenge of figuring out what's the best way to design and to site manufacturing facilities that take advantage of what's now, as I already said, a distributed and largely local feedstock. So this actually comes back again to one of these issues around scale. Scale is the next point here. But this scale occurs in two different ways. One is that the vision that I'm talking about is actually will require us to deploy biomanufacturing at an unprecedented capacity, but very importantly at an unprecedented productivity. And the reason that these two are so closely linked is because in the chemical manufacturing industry, where my education came from, the idea has always been that bigger is better. But we know from a lot of analyses that have been done that the transportation costs associated with biomass will kill you if you try to site a bunch of biorefineries on the outskirts of the country and send all of your biomass out that way. So there's both the ability to now think about, well, how do you do logistics? And then how do you think about actually having more efficient, smaller scale facilities that allow you to take advantage of a local feedstock that's available? The market is a big one, and I said I would come back to this point at the end. We do a lot of work on biofuels, and we've been working on this for a number of years, and we've become increasingly convinced that that work is critical, but it has to also be augmented by looking at how do we actually convert those carbohydrates to compounds that have a higher value and therefore have a higher potential of being able to compete successfully against petroleum-derived counterparts. So this part is really important. All the studies have said that everybody wants to be green, but nobody wants to pay for it. And so we think by actually focusing on some of these other markets, we have the potential to get to the cost targets that we want faster. I've mentioned this before, so I'll just say this briefly. The distributed nature of the biomass, I think, really leads to potential for enhancing local economies, and particularly rural economies in the U.S. And then finally, this is something I've mentioned as well, that these new feedstocks actually inspire us to think about new kinds of products. So let me end by actually saying that this is not something that we've just been thinking about at MIT. This is actually a report that came from the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago called The Future of Industrial Biorefineries, which was really aimed to think about what are the challenges in increasing the prevalence of white biotechnology. And then actually just in April, the White House Office of Science, Technology and Policy issued this National Bioeconomy Blueprint, which does incorporate all different kinds of biotech, including more of the biomedical devices, biomedical and health aspects, I should say, you may be familiar with, but includes the biochemicals as well. So we're certainly very happy to be working in this space and to see so much activity both nationally and internationally around this. So I want to leave you with one final image. This is how we think about manufacturing. Each of these is now an artist's rendition of a little microbial cell, an E. coli cell, and you can just imagine that they have little smokestacks coming out of them. And this is how we think about biomanufacturing revolutionizing the American economy. Thank you very much.
So Crystal, thank you very much. So we will take questions at the end. So during the break, when we have one, if you want to try to find your way towards me, or we'll have some people collecting questions. But during the panel discussion at the end, we will take some questions. So next, I'd like to introduce Marcus Buehler. He's the Esther and Harold Edgerton Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering, as well as the Director of the MIT Germany program, and the Co-Director of the Computation for Design and Optimization program. Today, Marcus is going to talk about materials by design. Marcus, thank you.
Just waiting for my slides to come up here. There we go. Great, thank you very much. It's really an honor to speak here, and I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to share some of the work we... Oh, excuse me. Actually, these are not my slides. Sorry.
It's audio and video.
Here we go. That's right. Great. Thank you very much again. Great to speak here and really discuss today a little bit about the work we've been doing on designing materials from bottom up. And it really ties in very nicely with what you've heard in the previous presentations. Ollie very nicely introduced this advanced manufacturing paradigm. And the way we fit in here, what I'm going to talk about today is really how we design materials using new paradigms, making them more functional, making them more efficiently and from less expensive building blocks. So if you go out and we make materials that we use for engineering applications today, typically a material like cement or steel, what we do is we go out to nature, we harvest things like limestone, we heat it up, we process it, we grind it, we produce a lot of CO2 by doing this, and eventually we get the cement powder and we put it together, we make buildings out of these. And what this is really a limitation in the kinds of materials we can make and the structural control and flexibility. If you like to make steel, you cannot use limestone. You actually have to take some other material, and the list goes on and on. What I'll present today is work MIT does in changing this and actually using a bottom-up approach where we can use fewer different raw materials, but actually enhancing the flexibility and properties by structural control, and by using really a systems perspective and integrating the design of the material and design of the product, and making these really in line with what the previous presenter, Christella, talked about, and using biology as inspiration to do this. In fact, this bottom-up design and structuring of materials and making function is something we see extensively in natural systems. And if you sort of look into biology and how biological systems create materials like spider silk, bone, cells, and other materials, typically we start with very few building blocks. We start with some letters of DNA. We start with some very few amino acid building blocks, like 20 amino acid building blocks, very simple chemistry. And these materials are then put together based on the structure in a self-assembling or spinning process, like you can see this here on the right, in this spinning process of silk fibers into functional materials. And these functional materials that we get out of these very simple, very inexpensive building blocks with actually very little energy needed to do this, because we don't need a steel plant or high temperatures to do this, but these materials just self-assemble. They create quite fascinating structures. And so this is a picture here of a spider web. And the way you haven't seen it probably, if you actually look inside the spider web, you can see a lot of structures in there. You can see fibers, fibrils, structures, nanocomposite structures inside this material, and eventually the chemistry, which really is reflected in the sequence of these amino acids or proteins that make this material. And this material, even though it's made by a spider in your garden, actually has the strength of steel. It's much more robust, much stronger to break, much more difficult to break. And again, it's made at very, very low temperatures. So this is a fascinating system. And the building blocks clearly here are very weak interactions, very weak and very simple chemicals. So that sort of paradigm is even more interesting if you now go and ask yourself, what other things can you make out of these proteins? You can make spider silk, which obviously is very exciting, but also the same building blocks, the same amino acids make cells. These are structures in cells. They make tendon. A collagen makes tendon. Attachments of muscle to other structures like rocks in the ocean, and the list goes on. And the functional diversity here is clear. You can make many different things, many different properties out of very, very similar building blocks, actually at the library of 20 amino acids that we have here. And this really sort of opens, the question is, why does this happen? And this is what the work, I think a lot of people at MIT and actually across the world are doing and understanding, is how does this work and how can we take this insight to our advantage in making new materials. And so what you see here in this picture is sort of this, we call it universality diversity paradigm, in which this universality of building blocks, identical building blocks, can actually be made into diversity of functions by playing with the structure at different length scales. And you can see sort of traditionally we use structural engineering in architecture and civil engineering, but now we can extend the civil engineering, structural engineering, architecture all the way down to the nanoscale, and we can create these structures at different length scales all the way down to the chemistry. And once we do this, we can actually achieve these multiple different functions out of these very few building blocks. This is what we see in natural systems. Now, How do we engineer this, right? So studying nature is interesting, but really what we like to do is to take this knowledge and exploit this in making new things, manufacture things, produce things. And here, the paradigm that we need really is an integration of computation, first principles computation, really starting from fundamental laws of physics, Schrödinger's equation, quantum mechanics, and bringing this together with new experimental approaches to actually measure and see what we produce and test the functions that we have. And this paradigm here is illustrated in the slide, where you can see on the left sort of a range of computational techniques from density functional theory that solves basically Schrödinger's equation, all the way to the traditional finite element methods that we use in engineering, is now sort of coupled to these multi-scale approaches in which we can simulate materials at all different levels. And experimentally, we have made even very equivalent advances. We can now probe individual molecules using light. We can test individual fibers and fibrils in material like silk or collagen, or test individual cells. And we can still do the conventional testing we've done before. We've actually really understood how to probe materials and how to make materials at different length scales. And the way this works, I'm going to show you an example later how this actually is at work in a specific study. So stay tuned for this. What is advanced computation? Advanced computation, I think, is extremely exciting to handle data. As mentioned this morning, these types of advanced simulations obviously produce huge amounts of data. Also, experimentation that we can now do with high throughput produce huge amounts of data. So how do we handle this? And so here, bigger computers are really a great tool to do this. And so this slide is from an article in Time magazine from last year that showed the development of computational power, availability of computational power over the years. And it's a very nice illustration sort of to show how exponential growth has happened. And nowadays we have these huge supercomputers available which are flexible. And actually you can configure your own supercomputer basically out of your office using services like Amazon. And you can run them, you can run your big codes, you get the data back, and you can actually do this kind of material design in a very flexible manner. So you can access these things remotely. So it's a really exciting development. It allows us to simulate extremely complex systems. And among these really complicated things is how these molecules really come together. So if you imagine now starting to play with molecules and the structure of molecules, see this movie here, how a little protein chain folds into a beta sheet structure. This is sort of what proteins do when cells make them. And when we make materials, we like to understand these processes really fundamentally. And this is now possible with these big computers. We can actually simulate the assembly of proteins, of molecules, how they make materials, how these different length scales emerge. And we can, using new experimental techniques, we can actually measure these things. We can not only simulate them, but we can actually go in and actually look at the structure of these molecules. We can pull these molecules apart, measure how they look like, and what kind of properties they have. And of course, once we have this loop in place, once we have validated this experiment computation link, we can use this for design. We can really make new things out of this. So, the next sort of 10, 15 minutes or so, I'll really discuss a case study to illustrate how these tools can be applied and how these things can be used to connect very different disciplines in research and education here. So this schematic really shows how these big computers can be used to predict, understand the structure of complex materials like spider silk. So what you see here is a nanoscopic view of a spider web, if you wish. And you see a molecule here. These are actually many protein chains sort of connected in a very particular way. In the center here, you see these highly dense packed regions, which are crystals. These are regions that don't like water. They don't like to be exposed to water. They stack very closely together. And the rest of these proteins sort of form a more loose structure, an amorphous structure, and these are hydrophobic domains. They don't like to be exposed. They like hydrophilic domains. They like to be exposed to water. And having a structural model like this, using big computers, we can predict that. We can actually start to test these materials. And these are sort of the building blocks, right, that we have now available, these proteins. And we can expose them, we can expose these to mechanical stress, and we can see how they break apart. And what we learn from these studies is what makes spider silk, as I alluded to in the beginning, so incredibly strong and tough and hard to break. In fact, these crystals, these tiny crystals here in the middle, these yellow regions, which are these regions that don't like to be exposed to water, they stick together, actually are responsible for the strength of silk. This is what we learn from these types of simulations and experimental studies. And for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to use symbols of A and B. So A are these crystals. B are these sort of more amorphous, more disorganized regions. I'm going to play later. We're going to play with these building blocks and make new materials out of these building blocks. So remember these two sort of characters, A and B here. So, so going back to this fundamental study of silk, what makes silk so strong, here is a great example of how nanostructuring and using nanoscale things actually allows natural materials like spider silk to become so incredibly strong. What we found here is that these building blocks in the middle, which really break the last. So if you break a piece of silk, what you really do in the end, you're going to shear these crystals apart in the end. And what we found is that the size of these crystals is really, really important. If you make these crystals a little bit bigger than how spiders make their material, these crystals become very fragile. So for those of you mechanical engineering, civil engineering, aeronautical engineering, you've seen beam bending problems, right? So this is sort of a traditional beam bending problem. If the crystals are too big, it's like a beam bending problem where one of the sides here opens with a crack, the system breaks down very easily, very fragile. If you make these crystals very tiny, if you confine these layers, and the scale here is 1 or 2 or 3 nanometers in scale only, these crystals don't like to break. In fact, they fail in a stick-slip motion. So you can sort of pull out the protein, and it takes a lot of energy to break one out, and then it sticks again because these are very sticky hydrogen bonds that form between these layers. They're very weak, but they're very sticky. And you have to repeat this process many, many times until you actually break the entire crystal, which makes silk so incredibly strong and tough. That's a lesson learned here. And you know, this is sort of the nanoscale, but really interesting is, and this is a really key element of this type of work, or designing materials, is how do you really bring this back to the macro scale, right? Because what we like to produce in the end is building a car, a vehicle, a device. And so the work we do as well is scaling these nanoscale insights up to entire structural scales. What you see here is a study of a spider web. So the question we asked here is, how does a spider web perform mechanically? So if you imagine now a little piece of prey being stuck in the web and a bird picking on that, or the spider sort of trying to rip that out of the web, what happens to the web? What kind of mechanical properties does the web have? And we've shown here, and without the details being presented in this particular slide, that the macroscopic response of this web, which is extremely robust, it can withstand very high loads of wind, very high wind speeds, and different kinds of impacts in the system, really is due to the particular molecular structure of the spider that you've just seen a few slides ago. So this nano to macro link is very, very intimately coupled, and the way this material performs really relates back to all these different structural scales, which fundamentally, as I mentioned in the beginning, really relates to the sequence of these proteins that are encoded in this genetic information that the spider has. Right. So this now sort of opens this opportunity for engineering things, right? And this is where we're going to take it now in the last few minutes or so. In the next stage in this work, we not only study the natural system like a spider web and the way natural silk looks like and behaves, which is fascinating, but actually ask the question, can we make these materials in our labs and potentially scale them up? And so what you see here are studies of a protein. Now we use these 2 protein domains, A and B, that I mentioned earlier, and we design new sequences out of these, which don't naturally exist. We can design them in the lab. We've designed 2, BA3 and AB3. So basically meaning that we have 1 B and 3 A's in the top, and we have 1 A and 3 B's in the bottom. And we then developed, this is collaborative work, and all this work, as you can imagine, really transcends many different disciplines. So this is actually work with Joyce Wang, who's an MIT graduate, and David Kaplan at Tufts. Joyce is at BU. And we've developed this consortium of a combination of theoretical experimental work. And Joyce has this microfluidic device that mimics this natural way how spiders make silk. They have the spider silk spinning duct in which elongational flow leads to this assembly of these silk fibers. We use this tool and sort of plug in these synthetic silk sequences we have created. And what we found is that one of these sequences, AB3, creates very nice fibers. We can make them in the lab. We can make synthetic silk fibers. The other one, BA3, does not form any silk fibers. And so the reason I wanted to show this example here is because it shows the integration of experiment and computation. We've designed the sequences. We see a phenomenon in experiment. We don't know why it happens. So these advanced computational models with these big computers and really going from the chemical scale to the structural scale can now be used to understand these phenomena, which we can't see with our eyes, we can't see with our microscope. So we've then simulated this process of how these silk proteins assemble, again shown here. And we can simulate these 2 different sequences and actually understand that this particular sequence, AB3, which forms these nice fibers, really opens up the possibility of forming a very dense network. So it connects these protein chains to one another and sort of creates these crystals that we talked about earlier and make a very nice fiber that has very good macroscopic properties. BA3, the other sequence, you can see what happens here. They are very good in forming little blobs, little globular structures, but they don't form a network, right? And because they don't form a network, they don't form nice fibers. And so this microscopic insight now actually sort of puts us on a whole different footing, because we can use this for design. We can run new simulations and design an even better sequence and basically make better fibers out of this. Right, so this is where this, I think, is exciting combination of experiment and simulation. Also, we can shift gears, right? We can go on and look at other systems. What I find fascinating is that this idea of understanding properties of something like a spider web, again shown here, really is something that really is found in many other disciplines. And it's really the connection of building blocks, like these A and B building blocks are connected in particular ways. They form a network. The network forms fibers. It forms a particular architecture of a spider web. We can describe this mathematically in a very abstract way, how these building blocks play together to give this entire system a function. This is a systems perspective of the chemical building blocks interacting at all these different scales. And we can then do the same thing for very different disciplines. So if you think about language, music, social structures, networks, art, etc., actually are based on very similar paradigms, where you have building blocks, simple building blocks, that interact to form larger scale structures, hierarchies of structures across different length scales or time scales in creating function. And so this is something we've exploited now in a recent sort of experimental study, which I think is a nice illustration of how very different disciplines can be connected, maybe in a sort of unexpected way. Here what we've done is we've taken the system again that we have studied computation experimentally, these two different sequences that form fibers or do not form fibers. And we took this information as insight of mechanisms and processes at different length scales, different chemical scales. And we now spoke with a musician, a composer. He's a professor at Tufts University, Professor MacDonald. And we went to him and we explained to him what happens at the scale and the physical world to these amino acids, the protein domains, to the network, and how they actually function, and how they fail to function when they don't form fibers. And sort of in music, the building blocks we see in musical composition are different. They're not physical artifacts, but they're tones, they're chords, and melodies. So we explained essentially to this composer, using this mathematical model, what the key insights, the key relationships between these building blocks are. And he then composed two pieces of music, which I'm going to play you, that actually resemble these two different systems. One that works, and this is the first one here. So that one was the one that actually, that sequence that forms silk fibers, and this one is the one that doesn't work, that doesn't form silk fibers. So what do we do with this, right? So there's various really interesting things we can do with this, though. So one thing we could do an experiment. I could not have told you which one is the sequence that forms fibers, which one doesn't, which just forms fibers. And we could do an experiment with an audience to see if actually the expression in music resembles the physical observation in the experiment. The other thing we can do is we can ask the composer, and this is, I think, the real value, the impact of this work. It might have, this is really a high-risk kind of idea. Can the composer help us to improve the materials design? If we ask the composer, can you make a better piece of music with all the building blocks, all the kind of sequences we've given you, can you give us a better piece of silk, right? And we can actually make that feedback. In fact, sort of this other direction is an interesting thing we can look at. These systems like silk and language and other systems really share a common structure, right? And this is something that really hasn't been connected a lot in the past, in where these building blocks are simple and worthless by themselves. But if you connect them in the right architecture, you create enhanced function. So we can do this even the other way around. We can actually begin to think about studying things like music or art in enhancing, informing how we make better materials, how we make better products, by understanding these structure-property relationships at different scales. And sort of, taking this back a little bit more now to engineered materials, things we want to actually make out of our synthetic building blocks. So we've talked about silk, we've talked about synthetic silk, we've talked about making links to music, but now actually what we maybe like to do, we like to use some of these really great nanoparticles like carbon nanotubes and graphene, which are frankly much better than silk or many other polymers we have in nature as a way of making materials. And in fact, we can do this as well. We can also use this abstraction and the interplay of building blocks and how they create function as a whole to translate now these silk domains into connections of nanotubes, polymers and nanotubes in making networks, bundles, and super bundles of these fibers. And we've done this in work where we've created super tough and super strong carbon nanotube, which actually perform much better than any kind of silk fiber. And this is, I think, the real application for engineering, where we can make these translations. So concluding here, sort of, looking at materials design clearly adds value, and specifically adding value in terms of using simple building blocks, raw materials that are abundant and cheap, that we don't need to switch out. Like currently, we really need to switch. If we want to make steel or polymers, we have to use different raw materials. Nature teaches us we don't have to do this. All we need to do is to change the structure in a clever way. Once we understand this, we have a huge potential in creating better materials, more function. Also, we can learn another aspect from biology, which I haven't really talked about here, and that's a feedback loop, right? Biological systems are exciting in that they can respond to changes in the environment. So the next level, I would say, in not only making better materials, also making materials that can respond to changes in requirements as they're deployed. And so this, I think, is a really exciting opportunity. And of course, this requires better training. And I think the MIT-X and edX initiatives that have been launched here are a great example how MIT leads in these fields, because any of the things I talked about here, and you've heard this morning, require better training, more informed workforce. And I think a flexible learning in modules to teach people about nanotechnology, a worker who actually operates the machine to make these silk fibers, is a great way of educating people and enhancing the processes in this way. And I'd like to thank you for attending and listening, and I leave it with this slide of a spider. Thank you.
You want to switch over the slide? Okay, so that concludes the little bit of the session before the break. We're going to just switch over. Now, I have some homework for you for the next 30 minutes. If we can switch up my, or actually just this one's fine. This one's fine. So we will have a 30-minute break. Let me just, as we're getting it up there, we'll start back up. I don't have a clock in front of me, but in 30 minutes. During this time, find me if you have some questions that we'll ask during the panel. After the break, we'll hear from some alumni entrepreneurs. And during the break, forget the slide for a moment, but just think about what is you're changing, hopefully, you're changing perception of manufacturing. Manufacturing, advanced or otherwise, what is it? Is it a rewarding and challenging technical career, the basis of our economy, fundamentally connected to our ability to innovate, and how technological advances do fundamentally become rooted into our economy? So think about those things. We'll try to get it up here so you can think about them during the break. See you back here in 30 minutes.